Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a historical journey, but this is no ordinary tour of antiquity. We're diving deep into ancient history using a really specific lens. One that, well, it rejects the traditional view of history as just a list of dates, kings, and battles.
That's right. Our mission today, it's pretty clearly defined by the philosophical framework of our sources. We're essentially unpacking this fundamental claim that history is driven by social forces, specifically this constant battle between classes.
Okay.
We're applying the lens of historical materialism to antiquity, from the rise of city-states all the way to the collapse of empires. The goal is to synthesize what our sources argue is, well, a kind of blueprint for understanding modern society, too.
That's a powerful idea. The almost seismic shift in perspective, really. Our sources are arguing that if we study the origins, the dynamics of these struggles in the ancient world, starting right from the dawn of class society, we get a much, much deeper understanding of our current capitalist system. We learn how institutions like private property actually arose, why they seem to persist, and, I suppose, what implications this historical pattern holds for the future.
Exactly.
So for you, the listener, this deep dive is maybe a shortcut, a way to see millennia of human experience not as just random events, but as continuous stages of the same basic conflict.
And it's important to stress, this isn't presented as just an academic exercise. The material makes it quite clear that understanding this historical lineage, how class societies form, fracture, and transform, provides essential lessons. Even, they suggest, tactical guides for modern movements that are looking for systemic change.
Tactical guides. Interesting.
Yeah, we're looking at the human story as this ongoing dialectical struggle, a struggle that, according to this view, prepares the ground for the next big transformation.
Okay, let's definitely unpack this. It's a monumental claim. Where should we start?
Right at the philosophical anchor, I think. We absolutely have to begin with the core thesis, the statement that really underpins this entire deep dive. It's a statement many people will recognize instantly right from the beginning of the Communist Manifesto. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles.
It's a very bold statement, yes. And the sources, they don't treat it like some abstract idea. They view ancient history itself, the material conditions, the economic setups, the cycles of stability and collapse, as the actual irrefutable proof of this thesis.
So it mandates a complete shift in focus, away from, say, individual heroes or villains.
Precisely. Away from individuals and towards the collective forces, the forces of production, and importantly, the antagonistic social relations they inevitably create.
I think that really highlights the common sort of surface-level prejudice the sources mention. When most people think about the ancient world, their minds probably go straight to what the sources call the narrative foam.
The narrative foam, yeah. A procession of kings, pharaohs, and emperors. You picture the pomp of Rome, maybe the golden tombs of Egypt, the wars of succession in Greece after Alexander. We're taught the history of wars and courtly intrigues.
Exactly. And the sources argue this focus on personality and court gossip. That's purely the superstructure. It's the legal, political, ideological reflection of something far deeper and often far more violent going on underneath.
Okay, the superstructure reflecting the base.
Right. They claim that beneath all those surface events was a raging struggle between the various classes that made up these societies. And this struggle, they argue, was rooted fundamentally in the ownership and control of resources.
Okay, let's try and delve into what those specific struggles look like, beyond just a generalized raging struggle. How did this fundamental class antagonism actually manifest itself in, say, ancient Rome? That's always a key example.
Oh, Rome's early republic is a perfect illustration, absolutely. The history of the republic, for a huge chunk of it, is basically the history of the struggle of the orders. You had the plebeians demanding political, legal, economic parity against the entrenched aristocracy, the patricians.
Right, the patricians holding all the power.
Exactly. And this wasn't just some political squabble over titles. It was driven by very material issues. The plebeians, often small farmers, soldiers, were constantly falling into debt bondage to the big patrician landowners.
Debt bondage.
Yeah.
Like owing so much you basically become owned.
Pretty much, yeah. The nexum, it was called. So the demand for written laws, like the 12 Tables or the right to hold public office, that was a direct reflection of the economic struggle. They were fighting to prevent being enslaved simply because of debt.
That system, the nexum, it sounds like a major internal pressure point, something that could tear society apart.
It absolutely was. The sources would argue it was an internal structural contradiction that really threatened Roman society early on. It wasn't necessarily Caesar's ambition that was the root problem later on, but this crippling debt that perpetually shifted wealth and freedom from the many to the few. The plebeians had to force reforms to even keep the system going.
And we see similar things in ancient Greece too, right?
Definitely. Think about the reforms of Solon in Athens around 594 BC. Athens was apparently on the brink of civil war, and again, it was driven by a crisis of debt slavery.
Solon, the lawgiver.
That's the one. His most famous act, the Sysactia, which literally means the shaping off of burdens, canceled all debts, and banned the practice of using your own body as collateral. Now, the sources argue Solon wasn't just acting out of, pure moral goodness. No. He was more like a temporary statesman, mediating an incredibly acute class struggle, one that, if it had been left unchecked, probably would have destroyed the whole Athenian state structure.
So if we accept this way of looking at it, you can't just talk about someone like Alexander the Great and his conquests in isolation.
Absolutely not. His success required these huge disciplined armies, right? Armies sustained by resources extracted from a dependent population, the classes that bore the real financial and physical burden of his massive expansion.
So the historical focus shifts away from the king's decisions and down to the economic engine supporting his rule.
Precisely. The stability and, frankly, the longevity of any ancient ruling structure, whether it's the Egyptian New Kingdom or the Roman Empire, was always conditional. Conditional on its ability to manage or repress or maybe partially satisfy these internal class contradictions.
And then they couldn't manage it.
Well, when the ruling structure got too rigid, maybe when debt concentration became too extreme, or when the exploitation of slaves just became unsustainable, the society inevitably fractured. The recurring cycle of revolts and civil wars in ancient history is presented as evidence of this.
So if history is supposed to be a guide, why do the sources stress the importance of studying the origin and history of class struggle in all periods and places? What's the practical takeaway for today?
The material insists this is crucial for both tactical and ideological reasons. If you see the modern world as simply the latest stage in this long historical class antagonism, wage labor following slavery and serfdom, then the lessons learned from past resistance become vital.
Lessons from failures as well as successes.
Both. Why did the Roman slaves ultimately fail? Why did the plebeians manage to succeed, at least partially, in their reforms? Understanding the structure of class alliances, the role leadership plays, the limits imposed by existing economic systems, it provides a kind of historical roadmap. It also gives a sense of profound continuity to resistance movements that span millennia. It reinforces the idea that the struggle today isn't new or isolated.
So it turns studying, say, Solon's Constitution or the Punic Wars into potential revolutionary case studies, analyzing moments where the economic base was either managed successfully or perhaps violently transformed. That's a very focused way to look at history.
It is. And to do that kind of analysis effectively, we need to understand the method, right? The methodology that allows us, according to this view, to see through that foam of royal intrigue and identify the real underlying forces, historical materialism. The sources stress that Marx and Engels studied many ancient civilizations, not just European ones, importantly using this method. They were trying to synthesize their findings into sort of universal patterns of societal development.
Okay, if I were new to this methodology, how would you break down the core analytical split? What are the layers historical materialism uses to dissect a society?
At its core, historical materialism seeks to discover the powerful, often impersonal social forces that truly shape human life. It posits a fundamental relationship between the economic base and the superstructure.
Okay, the economic base.
Yeah.
Like the tools, land, factories.
Exactly. The means of production, tools, land, technology, factories later on. And crucially, the relations of production, how people are organized to use those means. Master-slave, lord-serf, capitalist-worker, that's the base.
And the superstructure, what falls into that category?
The superstructure is basically everything else built upon that base. The state, the legal systems, political parties, religion, philosophy, the dominant ideology of the time. The sources argue that the economic base fundamentally conditions or determines the superstructure.
Can you give an ancient example of that, Link?
Sure. In antiquity, the reliance on slave labor, that's the base, heavily determined the Roman political and legal structure, which is the superstructure. It necessitated laws specifically designed to protect slave property and complex systems like the army, the courts, to repress potential revolts. The laws reflected the economic need.
And in doing this, this method directly challenges a really ingrained assumption, doesn't it? That the core elements of class society are somehow eternal.
That is the absolutely crucial realization, according to this framework. We are constantly taught, often implicitly, that things like the state, private property, or money are just natural parts of human existence, that they've always been there ever since humans started organizing in groups.
But historical materialism says no.
It challenges this profoundly. The sources vehemently reject the idea of these institutions being eternal.
So what specific institutions do the sources detail as being products of historical development, rather than timeless facts of life?
Oh, the list is pretty comprehensive. Private property, the institutionalized right for specific people to exclude others from using resources. Money, as a universal medium for exchange that allows wealth to be accumulated abstractly. The state itself, seen as a specialized coercive apparatus. And even, interestingly, traditional forms of the family structure, which are argued to have evolved to manage property transmission and labor.
No, even the family structure.
Yes. The material argues these are all specific historical constructs. They arose at a particular point in human development, driven by fundamental shifts in economic relations.
Let's pause on the state for a second. If we follow this logic, the state with its armies, courts, government, it didn't just emerge as some neutral referee for the common good.
Absolutely not, according to this view. The sources argue that the state's primary function is, fundamentally, class enforcement. Its very existence is tied directly to the emergence of class conflict. It arises from the need for the dominant class to maintain order and enforce its property rights over the dominated class.
So the state needs armies and prisons because of class conflict.
Precisely. It requires a specialized body of armed men, prisons, legislators, because the conflict between the propertied and the propertyless requires constant organized repression to manage it.
But wait a minute. Many historians, political theorists, they'd counter that. They'd say the state is also necessary for essential public works. You know, managing irrigation like on the Nile in Egypt, building road networks in Rome, organizing collective defense against external enemies. How does historical materialism account for those seemingly neutral or beneficial functions?
That's an excellent point, and the method does account for it. While the state can organize public works, the sources argue that even these beneficial functions end up being subservient to and shaped by the underlying class structure.
How so?
Well, take ancient Egypt. The need for flood control and irrigation was immense, absolutely critical, but the bureaucracy and organization that arose to manage it were, according to this view, immediately seized upon and utilized by the ruling priestly and pharaonic class. They used it to consolidate their power, extract surplus labor from the peasantry, and reinforce their ideological control. The state might manage the river, yes, but it manages it primarily for the benefit of the ruling class's stability and wealth.
So even necessary public goods get twisted into mechanisms of class domination, or at least used to legitimize the rulers.
That's the argument, and this whole structural change, the rise of these institutions, it wasn't a smooth, linear process.
Wow.
No, it's described as a long and dialectical process of development, meaning it's driven by internal contradictions. Often, the forces of production technology, skills start to outgrow the established relations of production, the social system.
Can you give an example of that contradiction?
Sure. In Rome, slave-based agriculture, the latifundia, the relations, became so centralized and large-scale that it started to undermine the viability of the small, free farmers, an existing production force. This led to social unrest, displacement, and eventually it necessitated a change in the relations themselves, like the gradual move towards forms of serfdom in the later empire, because pure slavery was becoming economically and socially unstable.
Dialectical. So the internal problems of one system create the conditions for the next system to emerge. And this is where revolutions fit into the picture.
Crucially, yes. The sources stress that revolutions play an inevitable and necessary role in this development. Revolutions are seen as those moments of rapid qualitative change, moments where the whole societal structure is violently transformed because the old system simply cannot contain the contradictions building up inside it anymore.
So not historical accidents,
Yeah.
but necessary accelerators.
Exactly. Necessary accelerators of historical development in this framework.
Okay, this brings us back to the present-day relevance. Why does knowing the specific origin of, say, the state's coercive power or private property give someone today a deeper understanding of capitalism.
It's about perspective. If you view institutions like the state, money, or property as eternal, as just the way things are, then you can only really tinker with them, manage them, maybe appeal to their better nature. You can't really imagine fundamentally getting rid of them or moving beyond them. But if historical materialism shows, or claims to show, that these institutions arose at a specific time, purely to serve class interests rooted in scarcity and exploitation, then it follows logically, doesn't it, that they can also be superseded when material conditions change fundamentally.
It demystifies the system.
Entirely. Grasping their origin strips away the mystique. It suggests that the current capitalist system, with its necessary state apparatus and property relations, is just another temporary historical form. A form destined, according to this analysis, to eventually be superseded by a system that resolves its internal contradictions.
This foundational idea that institutions are historical, not eternal, it leads directly to what might be the most radical and maybe optimistic claim in our sources today, which is the existence of a pre-class epoch.
This is absolutely critical. It challenges our deepest assumptions about human nature itself. The material insists that class division, the separation of society into exploiters and exploited, is not a natural, universal condition of human existence.
Not universal.
Not at all. It argues that for hundreds of thousands of years, human beings lived on Earth without any of the key elements that define class society as we know it.
Hundreds of thousands of years. That timeline, it just dwarfs the historical period we usually talk about, right? The last maybe 5,000 to 8,000 years since settled agriculture.
Absolutely dwarfs it. And during that vast expanse of time, what were humans lacking? Well, according to the sources, they lacked private property, they lacked classes, they lacked states, they lacked specialized armies, police forces, prisons, they lacked money.
Wow. So for the vast majority of human experience, organization was driven by communal needs, not individual wealth accumulation or inherited privilege.
That's the argument. These were hunter-gatherer societies, early tribal groups, often characterized by communal ownership of the essential resources, the hunting grounds, the tools maybe.
So this counters the idea that humans are just inherently individualistic or greedy, or that hierarchy is inevitable.
According to the sources, yes, it directly counters that. This long period is often categorized as primitive communism. Primitive not meaning crude or backward, but original foundational.
Okay, primitive communism. And what held those societies together and prevented classes from forming?
The crucial factor, the sources argue, was the low level of production. There simply wasn't a consistent, reliable surplus of resources or labor that could be accumulated and passed down. If everyone's labor is needed just for survival, there's no material basis for one group to consistently live off the labor of another.
Makes sense. No stable surplus, no economic incentive or basis for systematic exploitation. So how then do the sources explain the end of this epoch? How did we get to the class divisions we see in ancient Sumer, Egypt, Rome?
The shift, they argue, was driven by technological advances that finally created a sustainable, manageable surplus. The really crucial developments were things like intensive agriculture, learning to domesticate and breed animals effectively, and later, mastering metallurgy, working with metals.
So better farming, animal husbandry, metal tools, they created the surplus.
Once a society could reliably produce more than it needed just for immediate survival, once some labor could be stored effectively as grain or livestock or metal goods, then it became materially possible and perhaps advantageous for some to capture, compel, and exploit the labor of others.
The argument is that the moment human labor could consistently produce more than basic subsistence, that extra value immediately became something to fight over, leading to the split between workers and owners-controllers.
Exactly. And this new surplus required new institutions to manage it, to protect it, to distribute it usually unequally. Think about the most successful early class societies, the so-called hydraulic empires in Mesopotamia and along the Nile. They built complex states partly to manage large-scale irrigation, which was needed for maximum surplus production from agriculture. But then, this framework argues, they immediately used that state power to enforce the extraction of that surplus from the working population, the farmers.
So the division of society into classes is presented as a relatively recent thing in the grand scheme of human history, contingent on technology creating surplus.
Very recent, yes. And historically contingent upon those material advances in production.
And this isn't just like philosophical speculation. The sources claim there's modern evidence backing this up.
Indeed. The materialist asserts that modern archaeology has produced a plethora of evidence supporting this idea of class division being a recent arrival. When archaeologists dig up very ancient human sites, pre-agricultural sites, they often find very little difference in grave goods between individuals.
Meaning less social hierarchy based on wealth.
Exactly. It suggests limited social stratification based on accumulated wealth. The later rise of really elaborate burials for some, alongside very simple ones for others, or massive fortifications clearly designed to protect stored wealth, stark differences in housing quality. These archaeological indicators tend to map onto the timeline for the emergence of classes, supporting the view that this was a functional change, not something eternal about humans.
Okay, so if class society is a historical development, something that came into being because of specific technological and economic factors, what's the logical conclusion about its future, its eventual fate?
That is the ultimate implication offered by this perspective. It's quite profound. The material insists that just as class society came into existence, emerging from the breakdown of the primitive communal system due to its own internal contradictions and changing material conditions, it is argued that it must eventually go out of existence.
So the struggle continues, but towards an end goal.
Yes. The modern struggle within this framework is framed not as some futile utopian dream, but as the necessary acceleration of a natural historical process, a process moving toward a higher, potentially post-class form of human organization. One that theoretically could resolve the contradictions of abundance and scarcity inherited from millennia of class society.
All right, to bring this powerful but maybe still somewhat abstract concept of class struggle down to the bloody reality of antiquity. We need a concrete example, an example that shows the scale and intensity of these contradictions. And our sources point directly to one of the most famous figures in Roman history, but viewed through this specific revolutionary lens, Spartacus.
Spartacus is presented as a perfect historical materialist case study because he represents this massive, violent eruption of class conflict. An eruption so significant that it genuinely threatened to dismantle the economic foundation of the Roman state. Spartacus, who lived roughly 109 BC to 71 BC, was the leader, or at least one of the key leaders, of the huge slave uprising known as the Third Servile War, right in the 1st century BC.
We should probably set the scene a bit for the listener. The Roman economy in the late Republic, it wasn't just using slaves, was it? It was fundamentally dependent on them.
Absolutely critical context. The massive latifundia, these huge agricultural estates, were run by thousands upon thousands of chattel slaves, many captured in Rome's constant wars of conquest. So a massive slave revolt wasn't just a nuisance or a loss of property for the elite.
No, it was a potential collapse of their entire mode of production. The whole wealth structure of the ruling Senate class was at stake.
Precisely. And that's why the sources emphasize the sheer magnitude of Spartacus's actions. He threatened the might of Rome. Think about how it started. A tiny band of rebel gladiators escaping from a training school in Capua.
Men trained to kill for entertainment, but who were themselves property.
Exactly. And from that tiny spark, what a growth rate. Under Spartacus's leadership, that small band swelled incredibly quickly into a huge revolutionary army. Right. The estimates vary, but sources suggest maybe around 100,000 people at its height.
100,000 people, that's astonishing.
Not just gladiators, right? No, not at all. It included huge numbers of runaway slaves from the surrounding estates, but also, significantly, poor Roman peasants who had been displaced by the debt crises and the growth of the latifundia. Maybe even some discontented freedmen joined. It became a broader coalition of the exploited.
That number, 100,000, it speaks volumes about the level of just organized desperation in the Italian countryside at that time.
It really does. It demonstrates this wasn't just some localized riot or a band of criminals. This was a sustained, organized, and apparently quite sophisticated military campaign waged by the lowest stratum of society against the world's dominant military power.
And they had successes, didn't they?
Significant successes. Spartacus's forces defeated multiple Roman armies sent against them. They repeatedly humiliated the Republic's military leadership. At times, they even threatened the city of Rome itself. They operated for years as this mobile, self-sustaining community, offering a kind of temporary glimpse of a society organized entirely outside of Roman slave-based rule.
Which meant Rome had to take it incredibly seriously.
Utterly seriously. The full dedication of the state was required to suppress it. The sources emphasized that the full force of the Roman army was needed. We're talking about multiple legions commanded by top figures like Crassus and Pompey, who actually had to pause their own political rivalry.
Right. They united against this common threat from below.
Yes. They dedicated years and immense resources to finally annihilating the movement. And the way Rome responded when they finally won, crucifying 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way.
A horrific display.
Horrific, yes, but also a very stark, unmistakable message about the absolute necessity, from the ruling class perspective, of preserving the class structure at any cost.
Now, when analyzing Spartacus through this lens of historical materialism, the sources use a very specific and maybe loaded term. He's called a real representative of the proletariat of ancient times. That phrase seems crucial.
It is crucial, and it does need careful justification, absolutely.
Because it sounds like a potentially simplistic leap, doesn't it? Equating a slave who is literally owned as property with a modern factory worker who is legally free but sells their labor power. How do the sources justify bridging that gap?
The justification lies not in the legal form, but in the structural relationship to the means of production and the fundamental condition of exploitation. A chattel slave, yes, is literally owned, like a tool or an animal. Their entire output belongs to the master. A modern wage laborer sells their labor power, their ability to work for a wage, but the value they produce above the cost of that wage, the surplus value, is taken by the capitalist who owns the factory or business.
Okay, so the legal status is different, but the economic function.
The structural commonality, the sources argue, is the total dependence on the owning class and the systematic extraction of their labor for the benefit of that class, whether through direct ownership or through the wage system.
So the term proletariat here is being used in a broader sense, to denote the entire class of people in a given society who have nothing to subsist on except the sale or forced provision of their labor.
Precisely. It encompasses all those who are fundamentally exploited by the dominant class that controls the means of production, regardless of the specific historical form that exploitation takes: slavery, serfdom, or wage labor.
And Spartacus's movement fits this because
it was an attempt by the most fundamentally exploited class in Roman society to destroy the entire system of exploitation itself, not just to get better terms within it. It wasn't asking for slightly better conditions on the latifundia. It was trying to smash the latifundia system. So this framing places the slave struggle within that wider, ongoing historical narrative of exploited class resistance, linking ancient chattel slavery directly to modern wage labor under this banner of the exploited seeking liberation.
Okay, we've covered the philosophy, the method, the idea of a pre-class origin, and Spartacus as this ancient revolutionary case study. Now we have to tackle the core question of relevance head-on. Why does this ancient, ultimately failed, bloody struggle of Roman slaves actually matter now?
This is really the definitive transition point in the source material we're looking at. It moves directly from historical analysis to arguing for political continuity. And the claim is very direct. The modern struggle of the working class against capitalism is presented as a continuation of the struggle of Spartacus and the Roman slaves.
A direct continuation.
That's the argument. The historical thread, they claim, is unbroken because the fundamental contradiction, the extraction of surplus labor, the wealth created by the many being controlled by the few, remains the central conflict in human organization, just in a different form.
So they're basically arguing that every major class struggle throughout history, from slave revolts to peasant uprisings in the Middle Ages to industrial strikes and revolutions in the modern era, they all share the same fundamental goal, even if the enemy looks different.
Exactly. The goal, the sources argue, remains constant across the millennia: the liberation of humanity from the exploitation and oppression of the many by the few. Unquote. The specific mechanism of exploitation changes maybe from the literal whip of the overseer to the metaphorical whip of the wage system and the threat of unemployment. But the essence, one class dominating and profiting from the labor of another, that's seen as the enduring challenge.
That sense of profound continuity is powerfully illustrated by the specific legacy Spartacus left for modern political figures. That's one of the most fascinating details in our sources, I think.
It really is. It speaks volumes about how seriously this ancient history was taken, not just as history, but as a political touchstone. The source highlights the actions of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht in Germany, right after the huge political shifts following World War I, when they decided to found a new, explicitly revolutionary political group for the German working class, rejecting what they saw as the collaborationist policies of the mainstream socialist parties.
They needed a name, a symbol.
They did. And they didn't choose a contemporary labor leader or a recent philosopher. They took up the name of Spartacus for their new party, the Spartacus League, or Spartacus Bund.
And that wasn't just a random cool name, was it? It was a very deliberate, loaded, ideological statement.
Oh, completely deliberate, an uncompromising statement. By choosing Spartacus, they were signaling several things very clearly. First, they were rejecting incrementalism, reformism. Spartacus led an all-out war against the Roman state and its economic system. He wasn't negotiating for a seat in the Senate, so adopting his name signaled a commitment to the revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist state, not working within it.
It's also a claim of lineage, isn't it?
Yeah.
Connecting their modern struggle against industrial capitalism directly back to this ancient resistance against the very foundations of state power and private property.
Absolutely. It provided immediate, visceral context and, from their perspective, legitimacy to their revolutionary aims. They were essentially saying to the German workers, look, your struggle today isn't new. It's the continuation of a battle waged for 2,000 years by the oppressed against their oppressors. It created this powerful link between the modern worker in the factory and the Roman slave on the latifundia.
It really underscores the practical and political role that studying ancient history can play within this specific philosophical framework. The Roman slave revolt is lifted out of being just a historical tragedy and becomes this necessary, instructive chapter in what they see as an ongoing struggle for emancipation.
Exactly. And the final concluding thought the sources offer us is a direct, quite emphatic call to action, rooted in all this historical analysis. To succeed, modern movements must learn from them, the Roman slaves, and from all revolutionary movements. History, in this particular view, isn't some dry subject collecting dust in libraries. It's the essential school for revolution. And Spartacus is presented as a foundational part of that syllabus. #tag outro.
Wow. This has been a truly comprehensive deep dive. It really does radically shift your historical gaze, doesn't it? Away from just the actions of elites and towards these fundamental, persistent dynamics of social forces and class antagonism right across millennia. Let's quickly summarize the core nuggets of knowledge that you, our listener, can maybe carry forward from this discussion.
Okay, first, we established that ancient history, when you look at it through this specific analytical framework, isn't presented as just a procession of kings. Instead, it's offered as proof that class struggle, that raging struggle beneath the surface, is the core driver of how societies develop. We saw that argued through examples like Roman debt crises or the struggles in Athens.
All right. Second, we learned through this methodology, historical materialism, that key institutions we often just assume are eternal things like the state, money, private property, are revealed, according to this view, to be temporary historical constructs. They arose at a specific point in history, fundamentally to manage and enforce class divisions, which implies, in this framework, that they are not permanent fixtures and could be superseded.
And third, the huge historical example of the Third Servile War, led by Spartacus, really demonstrated this principle in action. The sources categorize Spartacus as a real representative of the proletariat of ancient times. They argue his struggle against the Roman system of production is structurally continuous with the modern working class movement. And that continuity was powerfully affirmed, wasn't it, by figures like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht choosing the name Spartacist League.
Absolutely. Now, for that provocative thought we like to leave you with, building on our discussion of that pre-class epoch. If, as modern archaeology seems to suggest, class division is a relatively recent historical invention, if humans existed for hundreds of thousands of years without private property, classes, or states, what non-class elements of that incredibly long pre-class life, besides just the lack of individual ownership, might we find most surprising or maybe instructive as we think about the future?
That's a great question.
Specifically, maybe consider the absence of things we take for granted. Specialized armies, permanent prisons, maybe even formalized, written laws in those early communal structures. What did early humans manage to live without that we now see as absolutely essential for social cohesion? And what might that suggest about the true nature of cooperation when you remove the constraints and the conflicts of class society? Something to definitely mull over as you digest this powerful and maybe challenging historical narrative.
A profound point to reflect on indeed. If you didn't need institutions primarily to enforce property relations, what functions would truly remain essential? What would society look like then?
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We'll see you next time.